heard a report on Radio 4 this morning about an Englishwoman, Maureen Searle, who'd moved to France more than 25 years ago and has just been elected as the first English-born mayor of a French commune. The commune in question is Mont-Saint-Éloi, near to Arras, which is very much on the landscape of the First World War, a village fought over between the French and the Germans in the early phase of the war, and then once captured was behind the French lines in the continuation of the advance there towards Notre-Dame-de-Lorette and eventually Vimy Ridge, and once the British took over this sector, behind their lines as well. It's a village that had some damage in the war. Many of the structures within the village show battle damage, but largely it survived those 4 years of the war, and there's a lot of evidence of the conflicts within that kind of immediate landscape around the village. So it is very much part of the story of the old front line. But the report made me reflect that while this is a significant milestone, in some respects this lady was pipped to the post by numerous British Army officers who became town majors in the Great War and who acted as a kind of mayor in dozens of French villages and towns on that landscape of the First World War. Now, while these town majors were not the actual mayors of the villages and towns they supervised, they worked closely with the elected mayor in those locations to ensure as much harmony as possible between the British and Commonwealth forces and the French civilian population. Because once we start to research the Great War in any depth, we frequently find that this harmony fragmented a bit over time, often before or after big offensives when tensions were high, and we can see all kinds of outcomes of this, from damaged property, physical assault, theft, and sometimes much worse. The typical town major of a small location was a mid-level officer, not always an actual major, a lieutenant or a captain, for example, appointed frequently by the divisional staff, the staff of that division that was now moving into this area. Occasionally it could be a more senior officer, a former battalion commander, for example, who might have been wounded and medically downgraded, a lieutenant colonel, and sometimes even a full colonel. And some locations, like at Ypres, for example, the position of town major was a semi-permanent appointment. They seem to have occupied that position for much longer there. And we do know a little about them because some of them kept war diaries, and these war diaries are now in the National Archives, and they make absolutely fascinating reading. Mont-Saint-Éloi, where Maureen Searle is now the mayor, would have had its own town major in the Great War after the British took over this sector in 1916. As troops were billeted there, a major role of the town major was supervising this billeting, and there was a Royal Flying Corps and later a Royal Naval Air Service aerodrome just below the village too. By 1917, the town major at Mont-Saint-Éloi may well have been a Canadian, because this was in the Canadian Corps sector. Because when you stand by the twin towers of the old monastery in this village, which can be seen for miles around, a national monument since the 1920s, and itself a veteran of the Great War, showing battle scars from the period, in the distance, on the skyline, you can see Vimy Ridge. So hearty congratulations to Madame la Maire in Mont-Saint-Éloi, and it was nice to think of those shadows of the Great War as well as the connections between Britain and France in this area of the landscape of the past, and how a new perspective from a new mayor may influence how people see and live on that landscape in the years to come. As always, it feels like the Great War isn't very far away. Now to this week's questions. Question number 1 comes from Martin Crook. Having visited the Ypres Salient during November 2025, this question arose. How was the changeover achieved in replacing all the wooden crosses in the cemeteries with the headstones we see now? Was it completed on a cemetery by cemetery basis or another method? How many stonemasons were employed by the War Graves Commission to undertake the process? And what kind of period from when to when did this take place? Well, Martin, if we look at the outcome of the Great War and this landscape of conflict across the Western Front, and we'll focus on that because this is where your journey has taken you, when we look at that, we see the legacy in cemeteries with hundreds of burial grounds across those former battlefields. And post-war, governments had to make a decision as what to do with the permanent burial and commemoration of the dead who were buried overseas, because this was conflict on an unparalleled scale and losses on an unparalleled scale as well. Now, many believed that the right decision would be to repatriate the dead, to hand them back to their families to be buried in family graves. But this wasn't really possible. Many of the burial sites were collective burials, trench burials, shell hole burials. On every battlefield, at least 50% of the dead were missing, and of course they could never be recovered and repatriated. So a decision was made to leave the dead in situ, and for governments, British government predominantly, to pay for the construction of permanent cemeteries. Now, this wasn't a particularly popular decision at the time. Many families were outraged by this because they wanted their boys to be brought home, but that just wasn't possible. But what to do with making these cemeteries permanent, replacing those wartime grave markers with permanent grave markers? Well, that in itself was a great discussion. There was a committee of the then Imperial War Graves Commission, and many fancied the idea of replacing wooden crosses with stone crosses. But, for example, you had Rudyard Kipling on this committee, who had travelled the empire, and he knew that not necessarily every man was a Christian, and he felt the whole purpose of these cemeteries was to memorialise the dead. So he pushed the idea of what he called a memorial tablet, which became the headstone, and that was the design that was adopted to replace original wartime grave markers with a permanent stone memorial, a headstone. And the work for this, once the design had been selected and drawn up, and what kind of information they were going to put on there, from regimental badges, military details, religious symbols, personal inscriptions, then it meant that cemeteries would have to be constructed with these engraved headstones being put in place to replace, for example, wooden crosses. And what they decided to do was to do this cemetery by cemetery, essentially, starting with 3 experimental cemeteries, to lay those cemeteries out in the way that it was proposed that all permanent cemeteries would look like. King George V went on a pilgrimage, and he visited these sites so that the king could give his input, many others besides. And at the time, the Imperial War Graves Commission decided that every cemetery would be classified by the nation where it was, so Belgium, France, and all the other nations where fighting had taken place, and then a number. And in the case of Belgium and France, the number, the lower it is, relates to when it was made a permanent cemetery. So the first 3 cemeteries that were these experimental cemeteries were France, numbers 1, 2, and 3. Le Tréport, Forceville, and Louvencourt, 2 of those on the Somme and 1 on the coast. And then all subsequent numbers of these cemeteries followed roughly the time frame of when that cemetery was made permanent. Now, we don't see those numbers used on any of the online records now, as far as I'm aware, but I have pretty much a full collection of the cemetery registers, and they are incredibly important in finding a cemetery within those volumes. They're in number order based on country. So Belgium 1 in the first volume for Belgium, France number 1 in the first volume for France, and so on. But it gives us a kind of idea as to what cemeteries were complete roughly when. Because if you tie it in with the publication date of the original register for those cemeteries, we can start to put together a timeline of what cemeteries were built during which periods and which were the later ones, and so on. So that work continued, and I'd like to say that they kind of sat down and thought about a discernible order of this work, so that when you look at the numbered cemeteries, you can see a pattern there, like all the Somme ones being done, then the Hindenburg line, then Flanders. It doesn't really work like that. It's kind of all over the place, and probably that had a lot to do with keeping some of those cemeteries open for the movement of graves from the surrounding area, so turning them into concentration cemeteries, But essentially the work went on from the early 20s, when the experimental cemeteries were made, through to when the last cemeteries were built and constructed in the late 1930s, with, for example, the Villers-Bretonneux Memorial on the Somme being one of the last that was built and finished by September 1938, so only a year until the outbreak of the Second World War. The headstone work within these cemeteries was done by British stonemasons. They were specifically selected because the text on the headstones was going to be in English, and if you use French and Belgian and other nationalities to engrave these stones, they felt that quite a high error rate could creep in and mistakes would be made. Headstones were then taken blank from the largest provider of stone for these cemeteries, which was from the Portland Quarry. They were pre-cut and sent overseas, sent to these depots where the stonemasons would work on them, and then they would be shipped to be placed within the cemeteries themselves. So the stonemasons would work in buildings at these depots, engraving by hand all of the headstones. Then at the bottom, at the base of the headstone, the name of the cemetery would be written in bitumen, black bitumen paint, together with the plot, row and grave location, and then it would be taken to the cemetery, the details matched with the cross or whatever was on the grave, and then the headstone put in place. Between 1920 and 23, for example, some 4,000 headstones a week were being shipped to France alone. A significant number of the stonemasons that were used by the Imperial War Graves Commission were employed via the Hopton Wood Stone Company, based in Derbyshire, who also provided the Hopton Wood stone, as I understand it, that was another type of stone used in the cemeteries, and they alone engraved over 120,000 headstones. Others were brought to work, employed via the Monumental Masons Federation, who it is said accounted for over 500,000 of the headstones that were placed in Great War cemeteries. And the thing to remember, as I mentioned when we talked about the depots, is that all of this work was done by hand. There were no machines involved in this, and there are photographs on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website showing the stonemasons at work in one of the huts of a depot with a headstone propped up, the details provided, the name and the military details being engraved, and then they would be given a template for the badge. There'd been a whole committee to decide on what the badges would look like, what form they would take, and some varied from the actual cap badges themselves to make them, I guess, easier to engrave onto the headstones. But when you stand in these cemeteries today and you look at these original headstones that are in them, because obviously since quite a few have been replaced over time, but when you look at the original ones, it is absolutely incredible to think that they were done by hand. So many of them. Hundreds of thousands of stones literally carved by hand. And I think it's a great testimony, really, to these men who worked on this project in that interwar period, creating these cemeteries and engraving the names of the fallen in stone so that they would be marked and remembered forevermore. Today, the process is very different. It's done by computer. So the details are brought up onto a computer screen. That information is then checked against the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database to make sure it's accurate. They have all of the badges saved as files, so you can pick a Royal Sussex badge or a particular kind of London Regiment badge, whatever it is, and then slot that in and then set it all up, have a blank headstone placed on the engraving area. And it's not done by hand anymore. I believe it's a laser power engraver that then does that work. So they can kind of press a button, go and make a cup of coffee, and then come back. And it's not quite done as quickly as that, but it is a fascinating process to watch. And you can go to Beaurain, the headquarters of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in France, where there is the Commonwealth War Graves Commission exhibition, visitor centre, and you can see that kind of work going on. They tell you about the use of the different types of stone, the work of the monumental stonemasons who did this, and that legacy of the type of stones that they use, all the problems they have with it, and you can see the approach that is done to this day, something I would highly, highly recommend. Moving on to question number 2, this comes from Frank on Buy Me a Coffee, where many of you very kindly support the work that the Old Frontline podcast does. Frank asks, I had not thought of machine gun barrages up until recently as suppressive direct fire events, but recently I've read a few articles and chapters that suggest to me that machine gun barrages were indirect fire events. I find this hard to believe, as the influence of wind on such a light projectile, the difficulty of ranging the fire, both suggest to me that indirect fire would be at best a useless waste of ammunition. So what were machine gun barrages, and if they were indirect fire, any accounts you can recommend describing being on the receiving end of one? Well, if we look at machine guns at the beginning of the Great War, every army had them, some more than others. And the role of machine guns largely was direct fire, where as a gunner, machine gunner, you can see a target on the ground somewhere in front of you. It might be some distance away, because some of these guns could fire quite considerable distances, and you could then fire directly at it. So these machine guns would support infantry assaults. As the infantry moved forward, the machine guns would lay down supporting fire. They could be set up on the flanks of a newly captured position to lay down fire if the enemy then counterattacks. So you advance across a field to a wood, you capture the wood, the machine guns come up, set up either side of the wood, the enemy then assaults over open ground towards you, and then the machine guns open up and hopefully inflict casualties and stop that counterattack from succeeding. That was one of many ways in which, with direct fire, where you're firing at an enemy you can see, how machine guns were used. Now, most European armies at the time were ahead of the British Expeditionary Force in terms of the amount of machine guns that they had. The Germans and the Russians had invested in the Maxim machine gun. So here Maxim had patented this design using technology to create an automatic weapon, and many nations had bought into that. The Germans and the Russians are the biggest example of it. The French, they also had machine guns, different designs, the Saint-Étienne and the Hotchkiss. And Britain, of course, also had invested in the Maxim design, with the Maxim gun, which was the type that had been used in the Boer War, and that was the predominant weapon that the British Army went to war with in 1914. It's not the same as a Vickers gun, which is a variation of that weapon. And in 1914, an infantry battalion, because there was no separate machine gun units in the British Army at this stage, an infantry battalion had 2 machine guns in a machine gun section under the charge of a machine gun officer. Both of them were these Maxim guns, and this then develops during the course of the conflict as it unfolds into 1915, when they increased the number of guns in the machine gun section to 4, and then in late 1915 the machine gun corps is formed under a raw warrant, taking the heavy machine guns out of infantry battalions and putting them in brigade machine gun companies that then are used to support with automatic fire all of the infantry battalions in that brigade. This was because trench warfare had obviously changed everything. In the British Expeditionary Force, heavy automatic weapons now in this new trench warfare take on a new importance. They're being used to deny ground and lay down these barrages, not carry out direct fire at an enemy you can see. That now becomes the role of light automatic weapons, like the Lewis machine gun, which is what replaces the Vickers that are taken out of the infantry battalions. And the Lewis gun is then used in that more traditional role of direct fire. It's a light machine gun. It's got a drum and magazine, 47 rounds in it. It's not got the rate of fire or the ability to lay down a lot of fire in the same way that a heavy belt-fed heavy machine gun can, but it can be used to engage an enemy that suddenly appears in the open, and as infantry move forward, it can be carried into battle and lay down suppressive fire at close range. The use of heavy machine guns, by this stage Vickers guns replacing the Maxims, although not every Maxim was replaced, I suspect, but the use of them in the barrage role develops from about 1915 onwards. There is evidence to say that the British had thought about this before that, but Paddy Griffiths, fantastic military historian and wargamer, wrote a series of absolutely fantastic books about battle tactics. The classic Battle Tactics on the Western Front is one of his titles, And he suggests that this kind of barrage seems to have been used for the first time in the Battle of Loos in September and October of 1915, when I guess it was pretty much still in its infancy in terms of its employment. When we move into 1916, we see both sides of the battlefield using heavy weapons, heavy machine guns like this in this way. So the Germans use Maxim guns indirectly as well to fire over the battlefield down onto areas, covering that area with machine gun fire. And a good example of that is when the Newfoundland Regiment go over the top in the second main wave of Beaumont Hamel on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. They emerge from their trenches, from the support line and the second line trenches, out into the open on a perfect summer's day, with the Germans on the other side of no man's land. Observers for the machine gunners with field glasses can see them doing this, and they can set the weapons up to fire over no man's land down onto this area, and the Newfoundland Regiment lose men even before they get to their own front line. On the other side, on the British side, increasingly the Machine Gun Corps, with its brigade machine gun companies, begin to do the same, and we have a good example of that. One of the more famous ones, Graham Seton Hutchison, who wrote many books on the Great War. He was a commander of machine gun units from the brigade level through to eventually the battalion level. He commanded the 33rd Battalion Machine Gun Corps in 1918. And in several of his books, he discusses the barrage that his company did on the High Wood area, where he claims fanciful numbers of rounds dropped into an area. This has now been disproved in terms of the numbers, but what we do know that it was an early example of one of these barrages being used to deny an area. So there wasn't necessarily any Germans in this area, but you can saturate it with machine gun fire to make them less likely to move into it and through it. So if you capture a trench, or in this case a wood, and there's a valley beyond it the enemy can use to counterattack, you drop machine gun fire into that area and it stops them from moving up to make that attack. So given all this, how did these barrages work? Well, you needed a group of machine guns to do it. One gun alone wasn't going to do this. So a group of machine guns were assembled under a central command, elevated so the rounds would go up and over and drop down into the given area, where there would be a defensive target you wanted to saturate with fire, or ground that you wanted to deny, or possibly an enemy counterattack coming in. I mean, whatever the circumstances. The power of the cordite charge in the 303 rounds that were used by the Vickers guns, and their kinetic impact, even over long distances, made them much more powerful in this role than I think is realised. So to go back to your idea of them being lightweight rounds that could be moved around by the wind, obviously there is an issue with wind with any round flying through the air, but these had quite a punch behind them, and you could drop them quite successfully into given areas and have effect by doing that. The whole thing had to be planned in intricate detail to work, with lines of fire, areas designated on maps to control the fire to maximum effect, and timings were really important in this, and everything was calculated to ensure that the whole barrage ran smoothly and to its maximum effect to take on an enemy position. And a 1917 manual, for example, notes, guns for barrage fire are organised into groups and platoons. The group normally consists of between 12 and 24 guns. If the group is considerably larger, it will be necessary to divide it into subgroups, each under a subgroup commander. The group is commanded by the group commander. So we kind of see a whole structure there of how a machine gun barrage is organised, bringing guns together from one or more brigade machine gun company. By 1917, you'll have had a divisional machine gun company on top of the 3 brigade ones, so you had a serious amount of firepower that you could use on a battlefield just within that one division, and then you had officers controlling it. And on the battlefield by 1917, that group commander in the BEF would generally be a brigade or perhaps even a divisional machine gun officer, and these were new appointments made within the brigade, within the division, by staff to make these whole things function. The rate of fire of the actual barrages was quite low from the documents that I've looked at, around 125 to 150 rounds a minute. So a steady fire, but not anywhere near the kind of top end of the rounds per minute. that Vickers guns could fire, which was anything from 450 upwards. This was done so that they could lay down a sustained and sustainable barrage, but it could be increased depending on the purpose of this barrage. Guns would then be rotated, given that you've got a whole lot at your disposal. Guns would be rotated so that barrels could be changed, because the more rounds you fire, the barrel will then wear out and the guns will not be as accurate. And you also wanted to prevent them from overheating. The Vickers was a water-cooled machine gun with the barrel in a water-filled jacket, and obviously the heat of the barrel would condense the water into the tin, and you had to ensure that you kept the water topped up so that the thing didn't overheat and jam up, or you had misfires. Now that's a very condensed account of how this works, but if we follow the pattern of how these machine gun barrages were used, we see, for example, Vimy Ridge in April 1917 becomes the first major assault, corps-sized assault with multiple divisions, where machine guns are used en masse as part of an overall barrage. So they become part of the barrage that is, of course, still being led by artillery, by guns, field guns up to heavy guns. But in the attack at Vimy Ridge, the Canadian Corps employ more than 150 Vickers machine guns from the Canadian Machine Gun Corps to fire with one of these intricate plans, these fire plans, onto the German positions. And gradually, following that employment of guns in that way, this whole idea is perfected as the war moves on. It's a turning point in the use of these weapons, and it kind of marks the increased industrial aspect of how this engine of war really changed during those 4 years. And going back to the German side again, Germans were largely on the defensive during the First World War, and they utilised a lot of concrete structures, particularly pillboxes or bunkers, as part of their defence. Now, if we think of a classic idea of a machine gun being used, it's from within one of these bunkers, firing through an aperture or slit, with machine gunners inside, firing away at men they can see advancing across no man's land, mowing them down. Now, from 1916 onwards, that type of bunker was largely not built. They were solid, constructed bunkers that gave the maximum protection to those inside, and the weapons that were also inside with the crew were designed not to be fired through a slit, but from the roof of the bunker, perhaps in an elevated way, to lay down indirect fire. And many of the bunkers, for example, had fire steps built onto the back of them, where you could get up on there, mount the machine gun, and begin firing from there. And if you want to see an example of that, go to the New Zealand Memorial at Messines, where there's two types of different bunker from different periods of construction, and the one, I think is on the left-hand side, is the one that's got the parapet, the concrete parapet that allows men to get up there and set up their machine gun and fire. So the use of machine guns in this way even influenced the design of bunkers. It's a fascinating subject, and again, we've only kind of dipped into it here. And as always, when it comes to machine guns, to discover more on this subject and the use of Vickers and other automatic weapons in the Great War, check out the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association. Richard Fisher, who we've interviewed on the podcast and hoping he's going to come back again soon to have a chat about things, and his team have done some absolutely fantastic work on the history and the deployment and the training and the use of machine guns in both world wars, and their website and their archive, which is massive now, is absolutely essential for your understanding of this, and I'll put a link to them into the show notes. Moving on to question number 3. This comes from Eric Holmstig from Sweden. Eric says, in the latest episode, West of Arras, you visit places behind the front line. Several of them, there are war cemeteries connected to casualty clearing stations. My question is how the environmental problems that can arise when burying many dead in a short time in a small area were taken into account. Decomposing bodies can cause major problems in water courses and wells, amongst other things, and today many investigations and surveys are required before permission can be given to establish burial sites. Of course, there were no opportunities for this at the front line, But what was it like further back, where the CCS were located? Did these burial sites cause problems for the local population in the years after the war, with poison wells, for example? Now, this is a really interesting kind of left field question, Eric, and I really thank you for this, because it is an important consideration in the construction of burial grounds. These things have to be taken into account. So, looking at this from a British and Commonwealth perspective, in the early period of the war, when Britain went to war in 1914, there were no real instructions about burying the dead. And what you see in those early battles, from Mons through to Le Cateau and the fighting on the Marne and the Aisne, and up to the time of the First Battle of Ypres, is that generally existing burial grounds were used to bury British dead, communal cemeteries, for a number of reasons. Firstly, they were already consecrated ground, which is a good place to bury your fallen comrades, and there were already areas selected for the burial of the dead, albeit civilian dead. But all of those considerations that you mention about pollution and watercourses, all of that had already been considered. So if you buried soldiers there, you didn't really have to think about that. And this begins to change, of course, with the circumstances of the war. So by that First Battle of Ypres in October and November 1914, you begin then to see battlefield and trench burials. The Germans overrun British positions. They find trenches, very rudimentary trenches, not like the later ones, but full of dead, and often the British soldiers are buried in those trenches, and one communal cross is put up. In many cases, the Germans have not looked for identity discs and things like that, because this is not really a massive consideration, and perhaps they don't even know about them. But it changes the way burials are made on the battlefield itself. And at that time, there was no consideration given at all for the environmental impact. That wasn't a consideration whatsoever. The burials just reflected the changing nature of the war and the scale of the loss as well. By 1916, what you begin to see when burials are made on the battlefield is the use of quicklime. The bodies are covered in the quicklime. It reduces the chance of infection by burying the dead, and obviously reduces the smell for those who have to continue to live on that landscape where these burials are made. And the idea behind the use of that quicklime may also have been a small consideration for the environmental impact, in terms of your covering the dead with the quicklime, and perhaps then the decomposition of those bodies will not get into watercourses and wells and other things. But of course, the quicklime itself could cause perhaps just as many problems. And there are many examples of this. We mentioned the Newfoundlanders at the attack at Beaumont Hamel on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Many of those lads killed on that first day lay out on the battlefield until after November 1916, when units from the 51st Highland Division cleared that area, and they buried some in the cemeteries that we know there today, Wyravine, Hunters, Hawthorne number 2, but one of the reports talks about finding fragmentary remains in no man's land and then burying them in a series of shell holes and covering them with quicklime. So that becomes a more common practice. Behind the lines, away from the battlefield, it's a different approach. Cemeteries behind the lines were frequently add-ons to existing French communal cemeteries, and were frequently designated as communal cemetery extensions. The permission for the burials there were granted by local authorities, for example the mayor, and going back to the town major, I'm sure he was involved in those kind of decisions as well, as the ground had already been selected for the burial of civilians. So it would, if you added soldiers to that burial plot in a separate plot, it would not be impacting water supply, wells, farming and other considerations. It may be that the British Army actually had to buy this land from the landowner, but records relating to that are fairly unclear. Later it was all given in perpetuity, but at the time there might have been some financial recompense for the farmer who had to give up a little bit of land to extend the communal cemetery. Locations where there were casualty clearing stations and field hospitals, which were established way behind the lines in open ground, so not on the edge of a village, not with a communal cemetery close by, then a burial officer would be appointed who would negotiate with the local mayor, again perhaps via the local town major, and ground would then be mutually selected for the burials and based on the same principles as adding an extension to a communal cemetery. So obviously the mayor is not going to agree to a cemetery being built on top of an underground fissure or close to a series of wells or, whatever it was. So that kind of thing happened in areas where medical facilities resulted in soldiers dying of their wounds and needing burial, and ground had to be then selected for those burials to take place with those considerations in mind. It just shows the complexity, really, of burying large numbers of the dead in a war where casualties from the battlefield were on a totally unprecedented level. And it's not just about receiving wounded, treating wounded, sadly some of the wounded dying. You've got to bury these men. Where do you bury them? What ground? Do you just bury them anywhere? And all of these considerations had to be taken into account. And in many ways, in many respects, these were the pioneers in this kind of commemoration, which had changed significantly in the century since Waterloo, since the last time a British army had ventured onto European soil. And what you see developing is the need and culture for burying men, burying soldiers individually, because that had changed too. At Waterloo, they were buried largely in mass burial pits. By the time of the Great War, burying the individual as an individual, commemorating them as an individual, was really central, not just to what would become the work of the Imperial War Graves Commission, but to the culture and lives of ordinary people. That's how society had changed during that Victorian and Edwardian period before the Great War. And it's a legacy in what we discover today on that landscape of the First World War, when we travel, as I did for that episode, west of Arras, across that landscape to the area behind the front, and we find those silent cities, as Kipling called them, acting as those beacons to the history of the Great War, each one of them a time capsule, and telling, of course, its own stories. If you spend more than 5 minutes in these places, they're not all the same. They may look similar, but they're very different in all kinds of ways. And none of them are there by accident. As the history, as we look up that history, as the history behind each one of those cemeteries will tell us. Our fourth and final question comes from Ryan Betts. Ryan says, I'm currently training to be a surveyor, and my question is centred around land and ownership. After the war finished, how was land and property ownership re-established due to the land and the battlegrounds being decimated by bombardments and unrecognisable? Surely most of the identifiable boundaries had been destroyed. Was there a compensation scheme or help provided by the government to rebuild these properties and clear the land? So when we look at a subject like this and we look at these towns and villages and communities that were completely destroyed by the hand of war, we've said many times how veterans, when they were crossing these battlefields while the fighting was still going on, often they realised they were coming into a village because the colour of the earth had changed. The brick dust and the stone dust had discoloured the soil, and that smudge of colour indicated they were now entering a place where a village had once been. Such was the level of destruction. Before the Great War, each commune within the town hall, the mairie, had what was called a cadastral plan of that village, which was an official plan showing the village, showing the boundaries of the village, and then the plots of land within that village with the structures that were on them. Each plot of land, with either housing or fields for farming, whatever its use was, they were marked usually by kind of demarcation stones, which are called bournes in French. And it was illegal to move those stones, and it still is, even on the ground today. The destruction of large numbers of villages and even some towns had often completely also seen the destruction of these bournes and the loss of papers in town halls, which had been destroyed by artillery fire, perhaps ransacked at the beginning of a war, and the records were lost. And what this then created, essentially, were two contrasting problems when the records for those communes were destroyed as well as the actual physical communes themselves. Problem number one was the inability of people where records were lost, who then returned and were unable to prove what they owned. If the cadastral plan was gone, how did you prove that that plot of land and that house was yours? Problem number two was the ability of people who returned to places where there were no records to acquire, shall we say, land that was not theirs because there was nothing to disprove their claim, and in some cases no one to disprove it either, as people had not returned to those communes. So you have two very different problems there when the records are lost. People who can't prove what they owned because the records are not there, and then people come back who, perhaps by another method, are able to prove that they own something in that village because the mayor remembers them and other people remember them, but then they can use the lack of records to increase their land ownership. Now, having lived in France in a village destroyed by the Great War, Courcelette on the Somme, the records of that village did not go back beyond the 1920s because they were lost during the Great War. The village was swept up by the Germans fairly early on, and whether they carted off the records or they were just left in the town hall and that was destroyed by later bombardments, I don't know, but they don't appear to have survived. And the records that do survive begin from that period when houses were rebuilt in 1922-23, for example. When we look at the population in a village like Courcelette, and this is true for so many on the former Western Front, the population decreased by at least a third in most locations, which probably meant people who did come back had land plots that were considerably bigger than the ones that they'd owned in 1914. And this seems to have been done by kind of mutual consent, and perhaps with officialdom, the town hall, the mayor, whoever, turning a bit of a blind eye to these land grabs, especially when the government were promoting the idea, pushing the idea, and wanting people to return to these places and repopulate these former destroyed zones of France. So with the lack of records and a kind of mutual consent between those who did come back to these villages, Pierre could suddenly see the size of his land double or treble. And as you can imagine, there's not many records confirming this one way or the other. And it is an area of Great War history that we know the least about, really. That post-war aftermath period and what happened in so many of these communes, it needs a lot more research. The eventual rebuilding of all these places, villages like Courcelette and the house that I once lived in, were paid for by the state. So the French government helped people rebuild their houses, their farms, their barns, whatever it was. And eventually, with the Treaty of Versailles and the forcing of Germany to pay war reparations for the damage that was done in the Great War, then eventually that money arrived, but mostly the French government had already paid out, and by the time that money did come in, most of the housing had already been rebuilt. And in terms of the clearance, we've spoken about that quite a lot recently in the podcast. That was done by a variety of organisations, from the British Army, assisted by labour units like the Chinese Labour Corps. German prisoners were also brought in to clear some areas, and the whole clear-up went on in a kind of series of concentric circles around the rebuilding of these communes and the eventual return to some kind of ordinary life, with people living their lives there, farming their ground, and all of that being possible once the ground was clear, the munitions were moved, the trenches filled in and the shell holes filled in, and the houses and the farms and the factories and everything else rebuilt. But the element of that German money that was brought in, and this is something I think I've spoken about on the podcast before, meant that when we look at communes like Courcelette and all those others that were destroyed and rebuilt, knowing that some of the money from German war reparations went into that rebuilding process, money taken from an emerging democratic republic, which the Weimar Republic was in the 1920s, helping to kind of financially cripple Germany, really, and creating this environment in which you see the polarisation of politics on the extreme left and the extreme right come into play and laying the path for another conflict in many ways. And I often used to muse when I looked at the house at Courcelette, am I looking at one of the causes of the Second World War? Do I live in one of the causes of the Second World War? I mean, it's not as simple as that, but certainly it's worth thinking about. So this is a fascinating, complex subject. There are records of all of these Somme villages on the Somme archives, most of which is online, with everything from surviving cadastral plans through to censuses and all that kind of stuff. And as that has emerged, it's been fascinating for me to see the kind of movement of people, the numbers involved in what a pre-war village was like compared to a village in the 1920s. So the material is there for someone to take this up one day and do some really important work on what the re-emergence, rising like phoenixes from the ashes of the Great War, the re-emergence of these communes in northern France, what that was like in that aftermath period of the Great War. So thanks for that question. Thanks for all of the questions this week. As always, keep them coming in via the usual methods of email and the Discord server, and there'll be the usual links to those in the show notes. And I'll see you all again soon for some more questions and answers on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.